All right, so just to remind everybody, we're going to be moving to the green volume again next time, right? So instead of bringing volume E, the pink volume, bring the green one next time. So I also want to remind y'all to complete the vocabulary quiz by Sunday at midnight, right? Because sometimes y'all been kind of forgetting to do that. So what would help you remember to get that done? Is there anything I could do that would help you remember that you need to do this?
Maybe send an email on that day, just do like that morning.
If I send an email on Sunday to remind everybody that, hey, don't forget to do this by the end of the day?
Is it due Sunday at 11:59 or Saturday at 11:59?
Sunday at 11. Yes, you have the whole weekend.
Oh, I thought it was due.
No.
Saturday at 11:59.
Yes. Yeah, you have the whole weekend. Right?
Oh.
So I put it up. I set it to start Friday morning, and then you have from early Friday morning until Sunday night. All right. So so I'll send people a reminder email on Sunday. So you'll have timeline stuff for me today. All right, great. So who wants to start? All right, go ahead.
July 14th, 1789, storming of the Bastille.
Okay.
It was a state prison on the east side of Paris, known as the Bastille. It was attacked by an angry and aggressive mob. The prison had become a symbol of the monarchy's dictatorial rule, and the event became one of the defining moments in the revolution that followed.
Okay.
My second one is June 26, 1794. It was the rise of Napoleon Wars.
Okay.
He gained military power in the French Revolution, and he defeated Austrian forces at the Battle of Flores.
Spell it.
F-L-E-U-R-U-S.
Yeah.
And then my last one is September 5th, 1793 to July 28, 1794. It's the Reign of Terror.
Okay.
The Reign of Terror was a period of violence during the French Revolution, incited by conflict between the two rival political factions, the Girondins and the Jacobins. And it was marked by massive executions of the enemies of the revolution. The death toll ranged in the tens of thousands, with 16,594 executed by guillotine and another 25,000 in summary executions across France.
Okay. Carol, what do we got?
Okay, in 1850, Napoleon defeated at Waterloo.
Okay, Battle of Waterloo.
And advocated again. It's how the second time he advocated, because it was at
Yep.
14th, I think, that he advocated the first time, and
Yep.
he came back to Waterloo.
And then they had to send it to a different year war.
Exile during the revolution. Since Napoleon died, he decided it was the opportunity to come back. He was the first exile whenever everything comes out. And then
Whatever happened to Louis XVII? They're going to write from 16 to 18.
yeah, I wondered that. I didn't understand
Yeah.
what happened to the 18th or 17th, and I was confused about that.
Yeah.
And then it was March 28, 1854.
Okay.
France and Britain declared war on Russia, launching the Crimean War. I was trying to do a different time because I stayed on 1815.
And the Crimean War, yeah, is one of the conflicts we're going to be talking about today, right? So there are three basic, that was three, right?
Yes.
Okay. So there are three basic conflicts that provide a backdrop to what y'all read for today. And it would probably help if we just kind of spell some of that out first. And then think about how it applies to the reading. So the first major conflict that Great Britain is involved in the 19th century, we now call the Napoleonic Wars, right? Which end with the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. They start around kind of roughly 1803. So we call them the Napoleonic Wars because it's not a single conflict, right? There are truce declared, peace declared at various points, and then war is taken up again later on. What this does end up like the basic cultural upshot of this for Britain is a large buildup in both the Navy and in defensive capacity, right? So we start building these towers, these fortifications, all along the coasts. And after the war, there's a huge surge in monument building, especially to the great naval hero of the Battle of Trafalgar, Horatio Nelson, and the great infantry and cavalry hero of the Battle of Waterloo, Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, who will later on become a Conservative Party Prime Minister. But yeah, these particular figures have monuments put up to them all over Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. And you will still find, most of these monuments are still standing. The big one to Nelson, for example, is in Trafalgar Square. There's a big one to the Duke of Wellington in Dublin, where he was born. It's this kind of giant pyramid structure in a public park. But the monument to Nelson was actually destroyed by the IRA in the 60s because it was to them a symbol of British domination, right? So these monuments become these kind of contested sites about what elements of history matter and whose history matters, right? Much like some of the debate that we're having over Confederate monuments today in the United States, and in Britain right now, there is a good deal of debate regarding monuments to people who were involved in the slave trade, right? I don't know about Wellesley, but Nelson was a slave owner, and much of his early career was spent in the Caribbean defending the interests of slave plantation. So this is something that's often kind of elided in the monuments to his greatness in the Battle of Trafalgar, but this is like one of the things that's kind of propping a lot of these monuments up, right? Now, the Crimean War, so this is the background to the selection from Carlyle. the couple of pages I had you read from Sartor Resartus. The Sartor Resartus is written about 20 years after the Napoleonic Wars are over, right? It's about a generation after the end of the war. So, about 1833 or so. Now, the Tennyson poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, is a Crimean War poem. So, Caroline, you looked up the Crimean War. Did you recall anything else about it, or who the combatants were, or what was at stake, what they were fighting over?
I don't remember anything else that
Okay.
was involved in it.
Okay.
But I do remember the poem in a movie.
Okay. Yeah, it's one of Tennyson's best known poems, and it's often used as a kind of uncritical celebration of military heroism, but I don't think that's actually the intent behind it. Well, in part because the poem seems to suggest that there was no need for these men to die. Right?
Because there was a mistake.
Exactly, yeah. They died because of a mistake made by
Do you
the...
feel like it was like
yeah.
sort of sarcasm because of the mistake, or?
I think there is, particularly the use of the word blundered, I think. We'll get into this a little bit more in a minute, yeah. But the fact that he says that someone had blundered, I think, the use of that particular word, I think, suggests sarcasm not directed at the Light Brigade, right? Not directed at the soldiers who were just following orders, but at the incompetent commanders who sent them to their deaths. Okay, so the Crimean War is fought primarily between the Ottoman Empire, which is why I've got 1853, not 1854 here as the date, because the Ottomans actually declare war on Russia earlier. Yeah, the primary opponent is the Russian Empire. The Ottomans' allies in the conflict are France, Britain, and Austria. So most of Western and Central Europe. Right? Weird. What's weird about this alliance here as well? What do we notice here for the first time? Yeah, together, right? Not fighting each other, but fighting as allies. Russia's primary ally is Greece, which at this point is still a relatively small nation that has only recently broken away from the Ottoman Empire and is just trying to preserve its own independence, right? So it's called the Crimean War because it's fought largely in that peninsula in Ukraine that is still contested territory, right, between the Russians and the Ukrainians. You might remember a couple of years ago there were a bunch of uprisings there where Russian citizens and Russian speakers in the Crimea were demanding that the peninsula be made part of Russia rather than part of Ukraine. The Ukrainians were trying to hold on to it, the Russians were trying to get it. So this is a region that has long been politically problematic, right? So for our purposes here, what really matters are that one, the relative incompetence of the British commanders revealed in incidents like the Charge of the Light Brigade create a demand for reform and professionalization in British military institutions, right? So,
Is this what they were fighting over?
no, this isn't what they were fighting over. This is what the upshot is in Britain, right? That because there are too many incidents here where commanders make bad judgments, there kind of grows in a public demand that wars not be prosecuted essentially by gentlemen amateurs, but instead by professionals who are kind of well educated and trained for the purpose, right? And who aren't going to make bad decisions like sending a light cavalry brigade up against an artillery battery of cannons. The other thing that's important here in the Crimean War is that it is sometimes referred to as the first modern war. And this is in part because of a greater reliance than in previous wars on new technologies, right? So the way wars have traditionally been fought, right, you get two armies, right? They line up in front of each other, beat the life out of each other, or shoot the life out of each other, depending on whether you're talking about, say the 14th century, the 18th century. And then whoever runs away first loses, right? Or whoever manages to hold the field wins. Your supplies basically have to be carried with you in a long train. Like it's hard to get things back and forth to the battlefront. And weapons were fairly simple, right? Early on, swords, axes, maces, things like that, bows, and then later on, muskets, right? Which still weren't very accurate. One of the reasons why people tended to line up in formations was because that was the only way you were going to hit anybody, right? A musket ball tended to fly out of the gun pretty wildly. Right? So with a lot of force, but not with a lot of accuracy. So, Crimean War, we see the first use of railroads in order to move troops and supplies back and forth. The telegraph as a means of communication between headquarters and the front lines, and between headquarters and the home front as well. And we also see in some of the naval battles the first use of explosive shells, which would become more prevalent as more and more, as ships start to be built with stronger hulls, often coated with iron, right, rather than simply being made of wood. It's also one of the first wars to be extensively photographed. And this is one of the reasons why the Crimean War makes such a big impact on the home front. Despite being a relatively short and, in terms of British interests, relatively minor conflict, because there are war correspondents for the newspapers actually out on the front lines taking pictures of battles and taking pictures of their aftermath as well. The public sees a lot more of this war than would have otherwise been normal, right? Kind of like how one of the things that inflamed sentiment against the Vietnam War in the U.S., right, was when TV networks started showing the flag-draped coffins of soldiers as they were brought home, right? It's not like photography means that people can't safely ignore them, right? It's brought home to them in ways it's hard to ignore. Now, the final conflict that we're going to be looking at here, and this is the one that William Howard Russell is talking about, is the Indian Mutiny of 1857, damn it, stay still, 1858. So what happened here, right, is that Indian troops who had been recruited by the British East India Company revolted against the company's authority and took several towns and forts and garrisons. Sometimes they took hostages, sometimes they simply sort of killed citizens. Right? But the basic idea was that they wanted the British East India Company out of India. So it was the beginning of a kind of rise in British, not British nationalism, but anti-British sentiments in India, and also in Indian nationalism more generally. Culturally, what happens here, the end result, is that India becomes what's called a crown colony. Now, to explain what that means, right? Unlike certain other colonialist nations, Britain followed a variety of different practices when it came to running their dominions. We'll get into more detail about many of those later on in the semester, but what we need to know for today is that India, up until 1858, was run by a private corporation, not by the British government. Right, so the British East India Company, which traded in things like spices and tea. In fact, this have either of you heard of the British East India Company before? Okay, in what context? What do you know about it?
Pirates of the Caribbean.
What's that?
Pirates of the Caribbean.
Okay, the Pirates of the Caribbean. Okay, so yeah, it's mentioned in the movie, right? This is also where the British East India Company owned the ships that the Sons of Liberty stormed to throw the tea into Boston Harbor, right? Because they had been granted a monopoly and favorable tax status that essentially gave them control of the tea trade, right? And so the Sons of Liberty were protesting that. So after 1858, the British government decides that the East India Company can't be trusted to run the country anymore, and so it becomes a kind of direct colony of the crown. It's ruled directly by the British government. Yeah. Okay. So this is basic, quick sketch of background, right? So let's have a quick look here at some of these texts, what they tell us about Victorian attitudes towards warfare. Let's start with the earliest. Let's start with Carlyle. Now, I'm going to guess that Carlyle was a little difficult for you, right? Carlyle's language is a little bit convoluted, a little bit strange, right? But I'm going to try to tell you a couple of things that might help you understand a little better what he's doing. Right, so Carlyle is not himself religious, but his rhetoric adopts the cadences of a Presbyterian preacher and of the King James Bible, right? Right, he was initially trained for a religious profession before losing his faith. And he grew up in a very strict Presbyterian family. So this religious rhetoric, and in particular, the rhetoric, the rhetorical style of British Protestantism is a huge influence on him. Now, the other thing to note about this, I only had to read about 4 pages of this, right? So it's not much of Sartre to Sartre overall, is the way it fits into a kind of larger philosophy that Carlyle is trying to promote.